Welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud. This right here is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1266, and it is titled Great Fighters for Freedom, written by J.V. Nash, and it was copyrighted in 1928. This is part 2, and we left off at the top of page 14, so that's where we start. In the same year, Bruno published another noteworthy work. This was The Infinite Universe and Its Worlds. In this, he sets forth in a masterly manner the grounds for his belief in the infinity of the universe and the possibility of life on other planets. Sense and imagination, he declares, are at once the source and the limit of human knowledge. The next significant book in the English series was The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast. This was an allegorical, satirical prose poem dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. Its theme is summarized as follows. A repugnant Jupiter resolves to drive out the numerous beasts that occupy his heavenly firmament, the constellations, and to replace them by the virtues with truth as their crown. He calls a council of the gods to consider this plan, and in a discussion that follows, numberless topics are touched upon. The history of religions, the contrast between natural and positive religion, and the fundamental forms of morality. This work was popularly regarded as an attack on the Pope or the Church as the triumphant beast. It too was no doubt one of the contributing factors in the Inquisition's vengeance upon Bruno. Space does not permit a complete analysis of Bruno's philosophical creed. He conceived of the universe as infinite and immeasurable. He abandoned the idea of a personal God, substituting an impersonal pantheism. For Copernicus, the universe meant simply the solar system, whereas Bruno's imagination flew out to the most distant stars, which he saw, in anticipation of the discoveries of later astronomy, as independent suns, each possibly the center of its own solar system. Bruno was an evolutionist nearly 300 years before Darwin, for he taught that suns and worlds and all that they contained had evolved out of an original formlessness, and after completing their life cycles decayed and dissolved. And he saw the immense whole as fundamentally one, every part sharing in the life of all the other parts. Bruno's magnificent conception has, of course, been fully vindicated by the progress of scientific discovery since his day. Spinoza, Descartes, and Leibniz drew the inspiration for their philosophical systems from Bruno. Boheme, Schelling, and Hegel were deeply influenced by him. Bruno's most outstanding mental characteristic was his practical common sense. His purpose, from the first, as McIntyre points out, was to use his own eyes to discover truth for himself, and to hold fast whatever seems to be right, irrespective of the opinions of others. His perfect self-confidence and belief in the power of human reason, especially his own reason, to penetrate the mysteries of things, was accompanied by contempt for the argument from authority and philosophy, contempt for humility, submission, obedience, and the speculative life. To believe with the many because they were many was the mark of a slave. Let me read that again. To believe with the many because there were many was the mark of the slave. Bruno, before Bacon, before Descartes, insisted on the need of first of all clearing the mind from the prejudice, all traditional beliefs that rested on authority alone, before attempting the pursuit of truth. Apart from Bruno's immense debt to Copernicus on the scientific side, there were a few predecessors by whom he seems to have been influenced appreciably. One such was Raymond Lully, 13th century writer. Lully was the author of a remarkable book entitled The Art of Reasoning. He was opposed to the methods of the medieval schoolmen. He taught a rational calculus, by which he undertook to make thinking as simple a process as an arithmetical operation, and he held that there should be no divorce between thought and reality. Lully is now a forgotten name. His ideas, however, made a strong impress upon the early humanists who were groping for a new basis of knowledge. Bruno published a number of books on the Lullian art. Chiefly, it seems to provide himself with sorely needed cash. As a matter of fact, there were fallacies in some of Lully's contentions, which Bruno quickly detected. He rejected particularly Lully's belief that the dogmas of Christianity could be proved by reason. Another medieval thinker esteemed by Bruno was Nicholas of Cusa, who, though a cardinal of the Church, has been called a pre-Reformation reformer. Of him, Bruno observed, "Had not the robe of the priest infected his genius, it would have been not merely equal, but far superior to that of Pythagoras. At last, the pleasant course of Bruno's life in London came to an end. The ambassador, Malseveri, was recalled to France. Bruno arrived back in Paris during October of 1885, carrying with him, it appears, the manuscript of a book dealing with the universe entitled De Imensio. After some months, he departed for Germany. He speaks of leaving Paris because of tumults, evidently riots arising from the disturbed political conditions. Refused permission to teach philosophy in the University of Marburg, he went on to Wittenberg, where he matriculated at the university and remained some 2 years. Nevertheless, he was permitted by the Lutherans to lecture on condition that he taught nothing subversive of their religion. He seems to have been fairly happy at Wittenberg. He speaks kindly of the treatment he received from the professors at the university. At Wittenberg, Bruno published other books which need not detain us here. In 1858, Bruno was again compelled to move on from the Calvinists, for the Calvinists had gained control of the university, and to them Copernican astronomy was anathema. Bruno next appears at Prague, where the Emperor Rudolf II had his court. The Emperor was reported to be interested in philosophy, and Bruno seems to have had some hopes of securing his patronage. He met only with disappointment. So Bruno went on now to Halmstad, where a new university had recently been established by Duke Julius as a model university of liberal principles. But the toleration which he expected to find here proved delusive. This time it was the Lutherans who took offense. Though Bruno had never been a member of the Lutheran denomination, he was honored by a formal excommunication from the great wing of the Protestant Church. The object of the Lutheran excommunication, like that of the Calvinist excommunication years before in Genoa, was probably to cause him to starve or betake himself away. Bruno, and no doubt the only man who has ever achieved the distinction of being formally excommunicated by the Catholic Church and by both of the two great branches of the Protestant Church. Had he visited Russia, he might have added a Greek Church excommunication to his collection. Heartsick and weary, Bruno, in 1590, again took to the road and made his way to Frankfurt, at that time the center of the publishing business in Europe. Here, in spite of opposition, he managed to stay for a time, working with his own hands at the printing of his books. It was during his stay in Frankfurt that the shadow of the stake first fell across his path. Since leaving Italy years before, he had, of course, little cause to fear the Inquisition. Now, however, there came to him one day a cordial invitation from a young nobleman of Venice, one Giovanni Mocenigo, who professed to be an ardent admirer of the philosopher's writing. Would not Bruno come to Venice to give him personal instruction? Bruno, suspecting nothing, accepted the invitation, but Mocenigo, apparently, was a tool of the Inquisition, and the invitation in reality a trap laid to ensnare the great heretic. Bruno, happy at the thought of revisiting his native land, set out for Italy. In due time he arrived in Venice, where he was lodged in Mocenigo's house as an honored guest. But the host soon showed his real character. Bruno began to sense his danger and made arrangements to leave on the pretext of returning to Frankfurt to see to the publication of some books. Mocenigo now showed his hand. Bruno was seized and locked up in the house. The following night he was delivered over to the officers of the Inquisition and taken to their prison on the 23rd of May of 1592. Mocenigo denounced Bruno to the tribunal of the Inquisition, enumerating a long list of extravagant charges against him as a heretic and blasphemer. Thus began the long 8 years of imprisonment, possibly not without physical torture on occasion, which Bruno suffered at the hands of the Inquisition. It is significant that the procurator of the Venetian Senate, after investigating the charges against Bruno, reported that his faults were extremely grave with respect to heresies, although in other respects one of the most excellent and rarest natures of an exquisite learning and knowledge. Nevertheless, in February of 1593, Bruno was transferred to the prison of the Inquisition at Rome. In the trial at Venice, Bruno had, in the hope of gaining his freedom, quibbled and seemed to yield, but after he was sent to Rome, where he languished for 7 years, he set his face like flint against the slightest recantation of his convictions. Finally, early in 1600, as we have seen, sentence of death was passed on Bruno. The execution was carried out so privately that Catholic writers, even in our own day, have had the hardihood to deny that Bruno was put to death at all. But there is unquestionable evidence of it from several sources. The most detailed account of Bruno's end is furnished by an enthusiastic ex-Protestant convert to the Catholic Church, who had come to Rome for the papal jubilee. The Pope was delighted with the glib-tongued proselyte, and made him a knight of St. Peter and a count of the Sacred Palace. This was one Gaspar Schop. Schop was present at Bruno's condemnation, and on the very day of the execution he wrote a gossipy letter to a friend in Germany, reciting exultingly the details of Bruno's sentence and execution, not realizing the service that he was rendering to posterity. Schop, in this letter, preserved for future generations Bruno's calmly annihilating reply to his judges. Greater perhaps is your fear in pronouncing my sentence than mine in hearing it. The last record we have of the devout Schop is a story to the effect that years later the English ambassador to Spain had him horsewhipped. Excuse me. Chapter 2. Erasmus, the first modern man. It was Erasmus who blazed the trail of today's culture. We like to classify and to tag a race or a people, and then to assume that all members of the group shall conform to the prescribed type. It is all very well until nature with a quiet chuckle comes along and upsets our carefully arranged apple cart. Perhaps it is one of her little jokes upon humanity. Thus, in hard-headed shopkeeping England, nature evolves a Shelley, the most impractical of men and the most ethereal of poets, while in Italy, the dolce for niente land, which we associate with beggars and voluptuous artists, she produces a Marconi, the electrical engineer who develops the wireless telegraph. From bigoted ultramontane Spain came the first liberal martyr, Michael Servetus. From gay and tolerant France, John Calvin, the gloomy author of Predestination and Infant Damnation. Who knows what she may some day, in a frolicsome mood, draw out of an American Main Street. She must have been in such a mood one day, 450-odd years ago, when a little Dutchman was born. The Dutch are a race which had been tagged as phlegmatic, solemn, conservative, and provincial. Yet Holland was destined to give birth to the most active and subtle intellect, the most satirical wit, the most urbane and universal spirit, and the most progressive force of that early modern world which the man himself was largely instrumental in creating. He towers above all his contemporaries, the first modern man. Okay, lost my place here. Hold on. I'm a little confused. Okay. That's right. Thomas Paine, in The Age of Reason, speaking of the long night of ignorance which settled over Europe after the destruction of classical civilization, observes, had the progression of knowledge gone on proportionably with the stock that before existed, that chasm would have been filled up with characters rising superior in knowledge to each other, and those ancients we now so much admire would have appeared respectably in the background of the scene. But the Christian system laid all waste, and if we take our stand about the beginning of the 16th century, we look back through that long chasm to the times of the ancients, as over a vast sandy desert, in which not a shrub appears to intercept the vision of the fertile hills beyond. The modern world could not exist until that wide chasm was bridged. It was just at the beginning of the 16th century, about 1500 A.D., that our first modern man, then a little over 30 years of age, was acquiring a European reputation, and the long intellectual darkness was fading before the rosy dawn of the Renaissance. With the appearance of the Renaissance in its intellectual phase, we begin to find men with whom the modern world feels a mental and spiritual affinity. Within 100 years, a brilliant galaxy of modern men had sprung up in different European countries. It included such stars as the first magnitude of Shakespeare, Cervantes, Copernicus, Bruno, Galileo, Montaigne, Bacon, and a little later Descartes, Spinoza, and Newton. These were all moved by a spirit of free inquiry. The trail which they followed was blazed by one great man, Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus was born in Rotterdam. He was the natural son of a priest named Gerard of Gouda, and of Margaret, a physician's daughter. There is some uncertainty as to the year of his birth. In later life he seems to have juggled with it himself for reasons connected with his illegitimate birth. It may have been 1466 or 1464, but more probably 1469. The Dutch at the time did not have surnames. Desiderius and Ursimus are merely Latin and Greek renderings, respectively, of Gerard, and they signify the longed for one, or the beloved. A delicate and sensitive child from birth, at 6 he entered a school at Deventer in 1487. After the death of his parents, he was led somewhat reluctantly into the monastic life, which he soon found unbearable. He escaped from the monastery by getting a position as private secretary to the Bishop of Cambrai. In 1492, just as America was being discovered, he was admitted to priest orders and went to Paris to pursue higher studies in theology and literature. From early youth he had shown a delight in books. Now he was in a position to gratify his taste at the greatest university in Europe. He appears to have supported himself by tutoring wealthy young men. One of these was an Englishman, Lord Montjoy, whose appreciation of the needy scholar's services took the welcome form of a small pension. Ursimus, however, even after he had acquired a European reputation, was often hard-pressed financially and reduced to the necessity of writing begging letters, some of which today are painful reading. Although his health remained delicate and he was particular about food and sensitive to climate, he loved to travel. He wandered through France, Germany, England, and other countries. In 1499 we find him occupying a professorship at Oxford, where he popularized the study of Greek and made warm friends. The biting wit of his conversation may be imagined from a remark attributed to the Lord Chancellor Sir Thomas More, who, on first meeting Ursimus, and not knowing his identity, was so fascinated by his repertoire that he exclaimed, "You are either Ursimus or the devil." Soon thereafter Ursimus journeyed to Italy, where, on the ground of health, he succeeded in inducing the Pope to relieve him of his monastic vows. He remained, however, in priest orders, and in 1506 he took the degree of Doctor of Divinity at Turin. The influence of Ursimus in England, to which he made 6 visits over a period of nearly 20 years, was especially potent and made itself felt in English thought and literature. Sir Thomas More got much of his inspiration for the Utopia from Ursimus, and in Shakespeare's time Ursimus was still a name to conjure with in England. One of the more interesting Elizabethan references to Ursimus occurs in Thomas Nace's The Unfortunate Traveller, or The Life of Jack Wilton, the first realistic novel in English literature. And I think I'll stop there for now, and we'll see you in part 2. Or no, part 3. This is part 2.